Hi, my name is Alison Garner. I'm a lecturer at Keele University and I'm also co-founder of Women Leading in AI. And today I want to talk to you specifically about the contact tracer apps that are being developed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The title of the talk here is Crisis Technology and how to develop ethical technology in response to a crisis. Because when you respond very quickly and under an awful lot of pressure, it is possible to produce technology that can actually be quite harmful in the long run and can really infringe upon your civil liberties and your privacy rights. And so there's a lot of concern with some of these contact tracer apps that they become surveillance tools, that the data that is being collected would be centrally stored and it could be used for other purposes, not just for checking on COVID-19 status and trying to retain and manage the pandemic. So how we balance this between trying to manage the pandemic, which we all want to do, and our privacy has been a big debate within the community. So just to explain a little bit more about these contact tracer apps, so the basic idea is that you can download an app onto your smartphone by various mechanisms, and there's loads of different protocols out there. Basically, your phone then will map your contacts that you do as you go around about your life and the status of those contacts. And if you have come in contact with someone who has tested positive, you will then be informed by your app on your smartphone that you are now at risk, and it will give you various advice depending on what that app is. So some might actually just say stay at home. Some might say, right, you need to go to be tested. Some might actually automate booking of your testing, and that's actually an important functionality, because I will say that only having a tech first approach or a tech only approach to managing the pandemic, using these tracer apps without the wider support framework of manual contact and tracing and testing, these apps have minimal effectiveness, and that is worth bearing in mind as we go through the talk. So in the real world, in any disease that happens, that is an infectious disease, if somebody is tested positive, they will normally go to a centre and then they will be interviewed by a specialist nurse or officer who would then say, right, tell me who you've been in contact with. So if it's for a sexually transmitted disease, for example, it would be sort of, tell me everybody that you have slept with and who might be at risk. And then there would be a contact process while those people would be contacted to say, you have been exposed to this risk and we suggest that you go for a test. They don't actually tell who has been tested positive. So there's a whole set of processes around that, and normally it works quite well at a low level disease basis. But when you have a big disease such as COVID-19 that is infecting a large number of people and very rapidly over a short period of time, that process can actually become very, very overwhelmed. So what a technological solution would be to help augment that process. And this is what's really important to say. It should be augmenting a wide-scale real-world contact and tracing program. It shouldn't be replacing it, and it will only work effectively if it is it's included in a process where you have access to tests very easily, so that people are dealing with real facts such as I am testing positive, rather than, oh, I've got a bit of cold today and I don't know. You have to have that testing protocol in place. So these tracer apps could, if used correctly, help augment this process and be very, very beneficial. So the way that they generally work, and there's various protocols out there, but if you have your smartphone on your app, it is collecting your location data, and there's a number of ways it can do that, but it's just collecting your location data, and you go about your day's work, and it's recording all who you've been in contact with, sometimes where you've been in contact with, how long you've been in contact with them, and even how close you have been in contact with them. So all of this information can be recorded either on your phone or at a central location. We'll talk about that in a few moments. And then at some point on day 2, as it says here, for example, you realise that you're feeling ill, and you actually get a test if you can get hold of one, and you test positive. Once you have test positive, You will then upload that information to your smartphone, and there's various ways that can be done, and to try and prevent gaming of that process, or people refusing to do it, or pretending to do it. And there's whole loads of abuse that can happen with these apps, so you have to be aware of that when you're developing. So for example, the doctor who has tested you, when you've got the positive test results, they would give you a code, so you can put that code into your smartphone and upload that information to the database. And then what will happen is immediately anybody you have been in contact with, usually was about the last 14 days. A lot of them are minimising this to about the last 14 days, because that, for this particular disease, that tends to be the incubation period, roughly. Everybody will be informed immediately by their smartphone that they have been in contact with somebody and will be given advice. So if they've become in close contact, they might be told to self-isolate, they might be told to go for a test. In fact, the test might be even booked for them, as I said. And others who have had minimal contact, they're just sort of slightly warned, they're given an amber warning, if you like, that they're okay. And a lot of this traffic light colouring is being brought into these apps to give people their COVID-19 status. And again, there's civil liberties issues with regards to what is your COVID-19 status, much like way back in the 1980s when the people were worried about HIV. And it used to be, I've done it myself on job applications and insurance applications, they did once ask, have you ever been tested for HIV? And it wasn't that you were positive or negative was actually irrelevant. For you to have been tested for HIV, they would have assumed that you were in a high risk group, and that would have an impact therefore on maybe your loan insurance premiums, your loan rates, whether you got a loan, whether you got a job, so on and so forth. And that was soon swiftly dealt with, and you can't do that anymore. But the same concerns now are being raised about your COVID-19 status. So hence this red, amber and green. Going along with the metaphor for traffic lights then, so a lot of positives with contact tracing technology. They log exposures rather than relying on memory. They help speed up the contact phase, can automate booking, testing, and provide information on quarantine and healthcare. But some of the problems with these is that people tend not to download the apps. And there's been some research that showed that if you have 40% usage, this is about breaking out of lockdown. So this is one of the key things about these apps, is it's how we do the exit strategy and we move out of lockdown. And the idea is that these apps will help us with that. And so Oxford University Group, the Big Data Institute, did some graphic modelling on what would happen at various percentage adoption rates of these apps, and if they used properly and effectively, how it can help prevent us getting that worrying second peak that people worry about. So the modelling that they did is that if nobody downloads, it's at 0%. At 20% download, we will still have a very high peak, in fact much higher than the peak that we're at now. At 40% it drops to about that peak there that you see in red, and 60% and 80%. And actual fact, what they say is that you need about 70% of people to download the app for it to be effective. However, there are problems with this. Go back again. Not everybody in the UK has a smartphone. Okay, so if you manage to get 80% uptake rate among smartphone users, that's fantastic, but that would only still cover about half of the UK population. 60% of people 65 plus don't own a smartphone. You drop down to 55, and I think that's about 45% of people do not own a smartphone. So you can see that it's actually not that common for people in probably the more high-risk groups to actually be smartphone users. So that raises those questions. And of course, we're also talking about children as well. And that's assuming an 80% pickup. As I said, the Oxford group think you should get about 70%. But in reality, even people who download the app tend not to use it. And in Singapore, which was one of the first tracer apps, and it was an ethical developed one called Trace Together, only 17% of the population installed the contact tracing app, which was launched last month. And so you can see that these apps do not have that wide amount of efficacy. on their own. And so if a government, for example, produces this as its solution to exiting lockdown without that supporting network of manual contact tracing and actual tests, it actually won't have the effect that we hope it will do, and then we'll see some of those more worrying second peaks happening. There's also problems with contact tracing technology that people are worried about. They're very concerned about data protection and privacy and how that might be compromised. They're concerned about accuracy with false positives and false negatives. And now false positive means that it's said that you've come in contact with somebody when you actually haven't. So some of these technologies can pick up the signal and say you've been in contact with somebody who's been tested positive, but it could be your neighbour on the other side of the wall who you actually have never seen and you're completely safe from, but you've now been tested. So there's issues with that. And of course there are also false negatives as well, caused by a number of reasons, again with people in sort of uploading, depending on the technology, saying, oh, I think I might have it, I'm going to say I've got it, and they actually haven't. It's not effective, as I've explained before, as a tech first solution. It has to be embedded within a real world situation, and there are concerns of human rights and equality issues. So for example, one of the things that people are worried about is they really want to break the exit strategy. They want freedom. They want to be able to go out. In very many ways, they're willing to give up their privacy of their personal information, their personal health data, so that they can be free. And it's about trying to balance people's right to privacy and their freedom. And that in a stressful situation, they are not being forced to give up their privacy because they're panicking about wanting freedom. And if you develop what's called a privacy first app that has real data protection in there, you can actually manage to get both if you develop them properly. Also, you have to have issues such as consent. Now, you have what's called informed consent. So when people understand exactly what it is that they are doing and why they're doing it, and what information they are giving up, and that is informed consent. Meaningful consent is to set up an app, a technological solution in a way, and the policy and the guidelines around it, where that actually people aren't just seeing a huge list of criteria and you've got to click agree, and people just, oh yeah, I don't care, I just want to be able to go to the shops when I want, yeah, I agree. Meaningful means that, yes, I agree with that, but I am going to actively share my data when and how I want, and they fully get involved in that process. And it's not this, well, do you want to die quickly or do you want to die slowly, false choice that you get, when actually the third choice is, well, I'd rather not die at all, for example. So in the development of these apps, there's been two ways of doing this location data. So you have various things such as GPS. Well, that will record your exact location, and GPS is only accurate really to about 15 meters anyway. It will track your actual location, and from that it will it is possible to identify who you are, where you've gone, and if that information is stored locally, centrally, and can be used for other purposes. This is where we start getting real concerns about surveillance and what will happen after the COVID-19 pandemic dies down. Is that going to be a mechanism by which we start having a population which has been highly intensively watched? So another technology is Bluetooth, which is accurate to 2 meters. There is, again, the little traffic light there is explaining to you that it's always not perfect anyway. How you are in 2 meters could be on either side of the door or in a crowded room. There is issues with that accuracy. It links device to device, and that's quite important. So rather than actually doing your location data, it just tells you you've been in contact with another smartphone app user, and it just speaks device to device. So you can actually make this a lot more anonymous, depending if you set up your what information is collected, and it improves your privacy therefore with that process, again depending on what information you have been required to link with that smartphone in the first place. So the Bluetooth is an issue there. There's also issues where some of the tracer apps require you to keep your Bluetooth on the whole time, and that then not only does it drain your battery, but it exposes your phone to being hacked. So if you've got your banking on your phone and all of this information and you have your Bluetooth permanently on, it really does have some security issues and privacy issues resolved around that. There is something called Bluetooth low energy, and a lot of the apps now are opting for Bluetooth and opting for Bluetooth low energy, which is much less energy intensive, and there are some processes where you don't have to have your Bluetooth on the whole time anyway. So I keep mentioning centralized and decentralized data. So this is the idea that you get this information on your phone, and all that data goes to a central storage unit, and they manage and hold that data. Decentralized data is the fact that this data is only ever held on your actual device. On your device, you own it, you control it, you can decide when to share it or not. And this is what I talk about by meaningful consent. And this is where there's been a big fallout at the moment between various frameworks and groups with regards to how this should be done. And so on one side we have centralised. Now the NHSX and PT frameworks that are being developed, they are partially centralised, partially decentralised. Other apps such as SafePaths by MIT, the Singaporean Trace Together app, both of those are open source, by the way, and other frameworks such as DP3T and Google and Apple work on a decentralised approach, which is actually much more privacy first approach. So this would be the recommended approach. So this idea of decentralized data, you hold your data on your phone, you are in control of it, not some central agency that you're going to have to trust, and you do not know what's going to happen to that and what they're going to pass it on to, without real legal protections, which we still currently don't have here. So how can you ensure data privacy and anonymization? Well, if you use a Bluetooth system, what some mechanisms do is that your phone will produce what's called ephemeral IDs every 15 minutes or so, and you'll just ping them all the time, and it's just pinging out to other phone devices. So as you come near them, it will record that ephemeral ID and locate and store it on its mobile phone. And then what will happen if you then test positive, you will put in your positive infection rating in there. It will note all your ephemeral IDs. It will be sent that off. So you select now to send that information off. So it does go to a central location, but it should only be those IDs. There should be no personal information there at all, and that will then be allowed to trigger out anybody else who's come into contact with that ephemeral ID. They know they've been in contact. So this really helps with anonymization. Other anonymization mechanisms actually are what's called pseudo can be worked around. They aren't really removing your name and your address and your postcode doesn't necessarily mean that your data has been fully anonymized, because you can aggregate data and still work out from that process who you are and where you've been. So key things about any data privacy first approach is that you only collect the information you genuinely need to know. People will create a case for knowing more, to prevent abuse of that data, so you know it's not going to go anywhere or be used for any other purpose. There is no need to track non-infected users, so anything that retains that information should, you have to question. And also, as the pandemic is over, that this technology should then be completely dismantled and removed. There is no need for it to continue afterwards. Interestingly, Google and Apple are forming an operating system framework, because all of these apps have to work together, and they have to work in a way that speaks to different operating systems. So if I have an Android and you have an Apple, those apps still need to speak with each other. So Google and Apple are working together unusually on developing this operating system API, and so that all of these tracer apps can actually integrate with them and talk to each other. And quite interestingly, they have fallen out with NHSX Digital and a number of other governmental tracer apps, because the governments are wanting to have this centralised data, and that goes against Google's and Apple's privacy standards. And so there's a bit of an impasse there. And so what Google and Apple are now looking to do is that actually what they'll store download automatically onto your operating systems is actually a tracer app within itself, but they have built in this dismantling process that it will end afterwards. We have to decide whether we trust them in that or not. There are systems such as MIT SafePaths, which use information that Google already have, so you're not adding any new information in there. So what we really need in looking at these tracer apps is they are not bad. We do think that they can add some real value to the whole process and speed it up, but they only work in context of a full system of contact tracing and testing. We must ask for what's called sunset clauses in them, so that once this pandemic is over, this technology then becomes obsolete and it gets rid of and it stops working, so that we do not end up finding ourselves in a society where we are being constantly tracked and surveilled by our governments. So therefore the use of the data should only be limited to COVID-19 purposes, and only very, very narrowly, no excuses, no trying to stretch that purpose and have scope creep, only to COVID-19 processes, and any sharing of data with third parties would have to be defined by law. And there's a whole load of other facts there that I've put down, but these are the key ones. So I'm not talking against these apps, but I think we need to be very wary that it's how we deploy them, and that they are a privacy first solution, and that they protect our civil liberties. Thank you.